Okay guys, today we are going to look at the revision of the cardiovascular system, specifically looking at the Edexcel paper for GCSE PE. So, when we're looking at the papers, the typical areas that get asked are on the screen here. So we have the functions of the cardiovascular system and blood redistribution. Now, these are probably the two main areas that you'll get asked questions on, particular blood redistribution. Other areas that tend to come up, but not as often, but they do come up, is blood pressures, questions about the heart, blood cells, and blood vessels. So we're going to go through each of these and spend particularly more time on the functions and blood redistribution. So if you're taking notes, you want to pause your video and get what you need for the notes, and we'll crack on. The first area we're going to look at are the functions of the cardiovascular system. Usually there are, in the books and on the specification, there are 5 main functions. So the main functions are transport of oxygen, transport of carbon dioxide, and transport of nutrients, but also regulation of body temperature and clotting of open wounds. Now, in this part, we're only going to look at, in this particular slide, we're only going to look at the transport part. It has the main impact on your sporting performance, and exam questions tend to ask about the sporting performance impact of the cardiovascular system and its functions on the sporting performance. Typically, you're going to end up with maybe 2-3 mark questions on this area. So if you know 2 of the 5, for example, areas in detail, then you should be okay. Now, I'd always suggest that we start off with looking at the transport of oxygen. The reason why, because that crosses over with so many different areas of different exam questions. And same with transport of carbon dioxide. However, we will touch on the nutrients because that crosses over to paper 2 and the nutrition elements as well. So if we start off with oxygen, and I'm sure many of you know this, but just to recap, the cardiovascular system obviously pushes the blood, moves around the cardiovascular system by pushing through the heart, beating and pushing it through the blood vessels. It will collect oxygen, obviously attached to hemoglobin. So the main role of the cardiovascular system is to transport that oxygen. All right. Common thing we need to remember, and it's always a useful point to put in your answers, is it transports oxygen to the working muscles. This allows us to work aerobically and produce energy, and those of you who do science will know that that is called respiration, so the process of creating energy on that cellular level, and that happens at our muscles, and we need the oxygen to produce that energy. Now, the application to the sporting performance, which will be the third sort of mark, is it will delay your fatigue, and if you look quite most of these points crossover are very, very similar. It allows you to work for longer, for harder. It allows you to run faster and last the duration of the game and maintain pace. If you're running in a race or sprinting, cycling or swimming, you will be able to maintain that pace because you have the energy produced by the oxygen through respiration. The second area is to do with carbon dioxide. Now, the body produces carbon dioxide when we exercise, which I'm sure you all know. The muscles will produce it as a byproduct, and therefore it builds up in our bloodstream. And the role of the cardiovascular system is to transport that carbon dioxide to the lungs to be breathed out, or to the liver to be processed and removed. Obviously, carbon dioxide is converted into lactic acid, and that's causes your body to struggle to produce muscle contractions and cramp up. So it's important that lactic acid and carbon dioxide is removed. Once it's removed, it can obviously delay our fatigue again. It stops us getting tired, and it maintains, and we again maintain our pace. We can work for longer without slowing down. If we don't remove it, and we have too much build-up of carbon dioxide, we will fatigue, we'll slow down, and we slow down so we can gather more oxygen into our muscles to clear that carbon dioxide and lactic acid. So I'll probably make sure that these 2 areas are the areas that you learn the most. The nutrients one, obviously the cardiovascular system, the blood will transport nutrients in the plasma. We'll talk about the currents of the blood later. So the blood plasma, which is the element of the blood that is really responsible for transport, it carries the nutrients. Those nutrients are used for energy in the muscles, so carbohydrates are converted, and fats are stored and converted into energy at our muscles, and that allows us to play for longer because you've got more energy. We can maintain the pace, so you get the same feel for these impacts on performance. The next area that could also come up, and probably more likely to be directly asked rather than just what are the functions of the cardiovascular system and the impacts on performance, is the concept of temperature regulation. Now, the first thing you want to point and put in the exam question is that as you exercise, your work rate increases. So your muscles are moving and they're producing heat as a sort of a byproduct of the reactions and the movements. Now, as our work rate increases, our body gets hotter, and it's not rocket science. Everybody knows that we heat up when we start moving around and exercising. To counter this, what our body does is it redistributes the blood, and this is through vascular shunting, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next exam questions. But the idea that we try to move our blood around our body to try and remove the excess heat is what we want to be drawing in on this sort of exam question. It goes to our skin, so then we can radiate the heat out, we can sweat it out, and obviously as the water evaporates from our skin, the sweat evaporates from our skin, takes the heat with us. And the reasoning, the impact it has on performance is to prevent us from overheating, but also it means like we maintain that quality and efficiency of performance. So this is a sort of 3-4 mark question about the temperature regulation, and work it through in those steps, the logical order of how it happens. The next area we're going to look at is blood pressure, and there's not a lot of detail or past exam questions that you need to look at and to revise in blood pressure. So the first sort of area that you need to look at is this equation here, this figure. Not equation, this figure. So it's 120/80 is our typical values for blood pressure. Remember that blood pressure is the amount of force that your blood is exerting on the walls of the artery. So as your heart beats and contracts, the blood is forced out of the heart, and that blood is a pressurized system. The whole cardiovascular system is a pressurized system. So as your heart beats, it pushes the blood, and that blood is then forced against the walls of the artery as it moves along and through your cardiovascular system, through the blood vessels. Now that pressure as a measurement, okay, in force, and the force that we look at is 120 milligrams of mercury over 80, okay. And you need to know that the higher number, 120, the one number that always sits on top, is called systolic blood pressure, or cardiac systole, and that's when the heart is contracting and we're beating the heart. Okay, when the heart relaxes, there's still pressure in the blood system, but just not as much, and that's called diastolic pressure, cardiac systole, and that's when the heart is relaxing. So the exam questions will probably just be something that asks you show you that figure here, and it will ask you what is the top number or what is the bottom number known as, or it might be a multiple choice question. If it does ask you to write in the answer of cardiac systolic blood pressure or diastolic blood pressure, you must spell it right. There's not a lot of questions where you really get marked on the spelling to get spot on, but these two are types of words that you do need to spell correctly. The other type of question you might get asked is what's the impact of exercise on your blood pressure, or the immediate effect of exercise on your blood pressure. And as you start exercising, our blood flow increases to the muscles. The heart rate increases, so we're beating harder and faster, stroke volume increases, because our muscles need oxygen. So our body's responding by moving that blood to the working muscles. And that in turn causes the blood pressure to rise because the heart rate's increasing, the stroke volume's increasing, it's more forcefully coming out of your heart. It means our blood pressure is going to rise. Okay, now we're on to sort of like the most commonly asked question in the exams about when it comes up to cardiovascular system. This is quite a complicated slide, but essentially this slide is your revision cue card. And we'll break it into two halves. So if you imagine this half here, the top half is the sort of the content, and in the bottom half here is a typical exam question. So if we just start with the top half here. The process of vascular shunting, or the word vascular shunting, should always be used interchangeably with blood redistribution. So if you see an exam question that says, what is vascular shunting? It's always useful to put in the word blood, or the term blood redistribution. If the exam question says about blood redistribution, always put the word in, the term in vascular shunting. It's going to get you a mark, just showing you know that concept. The idea behind it is that what our body does is it moves and diverts blood around your body to where it's needed. That's what the process of blood redistribution is. The vascular shunting concept is where the mechanisms behind it, where we will change the shape of our blood vessels, the arteries, to make that happen. So when we start exercising, we all know that blood is needed at our working muscles with oxygen. And why we need that blood is to get the oxygen at our muscles to create respiration, so we get energy, and that energy is to delay the fatigue, is allow us to work harder for longer, maintain our pace, etc. That usual sort of application to performance. And try to get an application to performance in most of your answers, because even if it's not asking for it, you might pick up a mark for that. And obviously if it does ask for it, what's the impact on performance? Put it in. So our body needs to move the blood to our working muscles for the oxygen. We only have so much blood. We can't generate more blood. So what we do is we stop the blood flowing to other areas that don't need the blood at that time. So at the time of exercise, we don't need blood at, for example, our digestive system. And we move our blood away from those inactive areas that don't need the blood at that time. Now, the process that we use is called vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So at the muscles, in this example, when we start exercising, we have vasodilation, where the lumen inside the blood vessels, the hole that goes down the middle of the blood vessels, will get bigger and it dilates. It gets from its normal size, and it increases its width and allows more blood flow through that blood vessel. So if that happens at our muscles, we have vasodilation, the blood vessel gets bigger and more blood can flow to those muscles. At the same time, we have vasoconstriction, so the hole in the arteries gets smaller and narrower, and then allowing less blood to go through that hole, through the lumen of the hole, which is that middle point inside the blood vessel, and blood flow is reduced. The blood is then diverted elsewhere to our working muscles. So you need to get the concepts behind vasodilation and vasoconstriction. There have been exam questions where they've asked you what is vasodilation and what is vasoconstriction, but generally it's going to ask you about the blood redistribution. Now, another type of exam question, and this is a really tricky exam question that exam boards like to put in, is where it doesn't mention the word blood redistribution or vascular shunting. And what they ask you is, why shouldn't someone eat before exercise, immediately before exercise? Why should someone not eat a meal before going on a swim? Why should someone not eat a big meal before going for a long run? They're the typical types of questions that the exam board like to ask. This is to do with the redistribution of blood, vascular shunting. So if you see that question, put in the concept in your answer of vascular shunting, the blood redistribution. Talk about that blood's needed at the muscles, and there's not enough for the blood to be at both the stomach and the digestive system and the muscles. So we divert the blood away from our stomach. And because there's not enough blood available at the digestive system, there's not enough blood flow, our body can't digest the food. So each of these sort of boxes would be your marks. If we were looking at it, you would start off with saying, right, we can't eat food before exercise because of the vascular shunt mechanism and redistribution of blood. The more blood is needed at the muscles, less blood is needed at the digestive system, and as there's not enough blood flow there, we cannot digest the food, which will lead us to feeling sick, feeling nauseous, but often a lot, and more commonly, what the common misconception is people say they get cramps or they get a stitch, which is not true. So make sure we break these sort of questions down accurately. Blood cells is asked fairly regularly, but it has been a recent question, and this is recent in 2024 when I'm recording this video. So last year it was asked. That doesn't mean it's not going to come up, but it has been asked recently. The two areas that have been asked most recently are white blood cells and plasma. Now, what you really need to know is what are the four components of the blood. So red blood cells, plasma, white blood cells, and platelets. You need to know them. You need to know what each of them does, and then the impact it has on performance. So it's quite straightforward. Red blood cells, I'm sure everybody knows this, contain hemoglobin. That hemoglobin is what carries the oxygen. There's about 4 hemoglobin to 1 red blood cell, so it carries that oxygen. That oxygen then gets taken to the working muscles. The working muscles use it for respiration, which can delay our fatigue, allow us to work for longer and harder, etc., like we talk about all the time. The white blood cells are designed to fight infections and part of our immune system. Now, we use white blood cells to protect us from illness, to fight pathogens and bacteria, and the main sort of application to performance in this sense would be that it allows us to continue to train. If we're ill, we can't train, so it keeps us fit and allows us to continue to train and then not miss our performances. So it's sort of like isn't a direct impact, an immediate impact on exercise, it's a long-term impact on our ability to exercise. The plasma is responsible for transport. It's the water part of our blood. It transports the nutrients, it transports the red blood cells, it transports the waste products. So the direct impact it has on performance are these two areas really. So it transports red blood cells, and then you go back down the road of saying red blood cells carry oxygen, oxygen goes to the working muscles, blah, blah, blah. We talked about this before, that it delays fatigue. Plasma also transports nutrients. And we talked about that earlier in the functions. So nutrients get broken down and used for energy at the muscles. Again, allows us to train and play for longer and harder because we have that increase in energy stores. So carbohydrates go to glycogen and we can create that energy. So there are 3 common ones, and then the final one is platelets. And this is the final part of the functions of the energy system, of the cardiovascular system. So platelets allow us to clot blood. It heals open wounds. Now, you want to sort of have, if this exam question comes up, have an example of how someone might get cut in a sporting situation. So clash of heads, a cut or a graze from falling on the floor, something along those lines. And the platelets allow us to stop that bleeding. Now, in many sports, if not all sports, if you're bleeding, if there's an open wound, you have to leave the field of play to get it covered up, or you get a blood replacement in some sports like rugby, where you can go off, get stitches, and then come back on and play. So what they can't have is, because of the transfer of illnesses, diseases, and bacteria, we cannot have open wounds in games and in sports. So the idea is if you can clot that blood, if the blood can clot itself and stop the bleeding, you can continue to play, you can continue to train without that break in play. So the 4 areas of the blood. Now, the heart is obviously a major part of the cardiovascular system, but typically exam board questions really focus on just knowing the parts of the heart and what they do. So you really want to be sure of the four chambers of the heart, so the atrium at the top and the ventricles at the bottom. And this is usually a multiple choice question that will ask you to, like in the picture here, what is A, what is D, for example, what is C. They're the types of questions that you might get in a multiple choice, and they give you a series of choices and you just tick the right ones. So, you know, the atrium's at the top, the ventricles at the bottom, but then we need to know a couple of the major blood vessels. So the vena cava comes in and feeds into the atrium over here, the right atrium. And if you get an exam question that asks you which blood vessel carries deoxygenated blood to the heart or something like that, it's the vena cava. You need to try and remember the basics with it. And the idea is it takes the blood from the body and puts it into the heart. And the heart then pushes it over to the lungs. The aorta is probably the most asked question on the blood vessels of the heart. And the key thing it really wants to know is that the aorta is taking the oxygenated blood away from the heart to the body. So leaving the left ventricle and it's going out through to the body. Now this is a typical type of question. It might be just a 1 or 2 mark question and it might be fill in the gaps. So you need the word like aorta and then to the body or something like that. Not rarely asked, but you just need to make sure you understand it. It's a pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein. Remember, pulmonary is to do with respiration and lungs. Arteries take blood away from the heart, the A for away, and the veins with the veins go into the heart. So just try to remember the order that those go into. Rarely do you get asked questions on the valves, but just make sure you remember what the valves do. They prevent backflow. It's quite hard words to try and remember the bicuspid and tricuspid valves in the middle of the heart and the semilunar valves that go into the major blood vessels. So they're quite hard to remember those words, but just remember that the valves prevent backflow. So blood is constantly moving forwards. Another area that's not asked a lot is about blood vessels. I've just mentioned about a way of remembering the veins, and the in veins go in and directly back towards the heart, whereas arteries away from the heart. So just try and remember that sort of mnemonic. And then try to remember, and this is like taken from an exam question which sort of summarizes it quite well, where you get shown maybe this sort of table and then you have to pick which blood vessel is shown in A, B and C, or A, B. Now try and remember what the pressure they operate at and the thickness of the blood vessel. So if we're talking about pressures, the arteries operate under a very high pressure because they are coming away from the heart. The heart is pushing the blood and it's the closest to the heart. The arteries have the highest amount of pressure, and as the blood moves around your body and goes to the muscles, etc., the pressure slowly drops. So the highest pressure is the arteries. Because they're operating at a high pressure, they have the thickest walls. So arteries have thick muscular walls, and if they weren't thick enough, the arteries wouldn't be able to cope with the pressure that was being applied on them. Okay, then the arteries will essentially go through the various blood vessels to become capillaries. Now the capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, and they join our arteries and veins together, but they also go to our muscles and they go to our lungs and the alveoli, where we can allow the gaseous exchange and the transfer and diffusion of gases, so carbon dioxide and oxygen, in what we're looking at. They operate at a low pressure, and the low pressure is because we want the blood to slow down so it has time for the diffusion to take place. If it's going too fast, the oxygen can't jump out of the blood vessels, so we need it to slow down. The way it does that is by creating a larger surface area and spreading that blood out into a larger surface area and also because it's such a thin blood vessel, you can only have one blood cell going through at a time, which slows it all down and the pressure reduces. They've got thin walls, so allow that diffusion to take place. So capillaries. And And then the veins have a low pressure. The key thing with veins, if the exam question comes up on it, which in fairness hasn't asked in the past, is that they have valves to prevent backflow, which keeps the blood moving forwards. So again, if you might see this exam question, start thinking about, well, which of them has the highest pressure, which has the lowest pressure, which has the thickest walls, which has the thinnest walls. If the blood was too low, blood pressure was too low, say like here, then our body can't circulate the blood. So it doesn't want to be too low a pressure. It needs to keep moving, but it's just something to have that in mind. But when you're revising the blood vessels, just think which ones blood vessels have the highest pressure, which have the lowest pressure. And finally, the last part that you need to revise on the cardiovascular system is just these key definitions, really, and these come on to responses of exercise as well. So as part of our cardiovascular system, when our heart beats, it pushes blood out of the heart, and if it beats in one beat, we measure the blood in one beat, is called stroke volume. So the amount of blood ejected from the heart per beat is stroke volume. Definition you just need to know. It might ask you to define it in an exam question. The other area we need to know is called cardiac output, which is basically our stroke volume multiplied by our heart rate, and it's the amount of blood that we push out of the heart per minute. Now, if you remember, the heart rate is measured in beats per minute, BPM. So our cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And that's a typical type of exam question you might get, a simple 2-mark exam question. It's worth revising these two because if the question asks responses to exercise, in response, both these will increase, or these will increase, our heart rate will increase, stroke volume will increase because we're pushing more blood out of the heart per beat per minute, and the cardiac output will also increase because the heart rate's gone up and the stroke volume's gone up. So, as a response to our exercise, make sure we know these definitions because they could get asked in the cardiovascular system. So there's a whistle-stop tour of the cardiovascular system. All the major and main questions summarised, and best of luck in your GCSE exams.